We often speak of the greatest acts of loyalty during the Second World War. But what if the only way to prove your loyalty to your nation was to volunteer to fight for the very government that had already declared you an enemy alien, seized your property, and locked your entire family behind barbed wire? This is the story of Frank Minoru Wada, a Japanese-American citizen whose personal sacrifice epitomizes one of the most extraordinary and morally complex chapters in American military history. His journey from a California farm to the brutal European battlefields wasn't merely a fight against fascism abroad. It was a desperate, high-stakes battle to prove that he and 18,000 Nisei soldiers deserved to be recognized as fully American. Frank Wada was born on July 23, 1921, in Redlands, California. He grew up experiencing severe discrimination. He could only swim in the public pool on Mondays, the day reserved for non-white children, after the water had been drained and cleaned for white swimmers. But in 1942, despite his American birth and citizenship, he learned that the American military immediately rejected his enlistment bid after the Pearl Harbor attack. He was instantly classified on his local draft board as an enemy alien. 3 months later, Frank Wada received a notice posted on a lamppost ordering him to dispose of his belongings and prepare for mass imprisonment. He would soon trade his life on a farm surrounded by family for a single year spent behind barbed wire, guarded by soldiers with machine guns pointed inward. Yet within that desolate confinement, Wada decided to volunteer for the United States Army. The question was not if he would fight, but for whom he would have to fight. The question Frank Wada faced after receiving his notice was not merely where to go, but how to dispose of a lifetime's possessions in 48 hours. 3 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the evacuation order was delivered via notices posted on lampposts and telephone poles, demanding that 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry prepare for mass imprisonment. The evacuation process was described as chaotic and cruel. Families were given just 48 hours to dispose of homes, businesses, and possessions accumulated over generations. Frank Wada noted that the rules changed after 3 days, compelling his family to take just 1 suitcase per person. Wada decided his mother should take 1 suitcase as a poignant reminder of the government order. This forced exodus led to opportunistic buyers seizing thousands of properties, which were sold under duress in forced sales. The economic devastation for Japanese Americans was calculated at $1.3 billion in property and $2.7 billion in lost income using 1983 dollars, totaling an estimated $4 to $6.2 billion in current values. Frank Wada, along with his family, first spent time at the Santa Anita Assembly Center in filthy horse stables before being transferred to a permanent confinement facility. That facility was Poston, Arizona, located deep in the Sonoran Desert. This remote and inhospitable location became Arizona's 3rd largest town during the war, peaking at nearly 18,000 residents. Life behind the barbed wire was designed for daily humiliation and hardship. Families lived in tar paper barracks. A single room, measuring only 20 by 25 feet, housed approximately 8 people regardless of age or relationship. There were no private dining rooms, no private bathrooms, and no space for solitude. The prisoners were guarded by soldiers with machine guns pointed inward. Frank Wada spent 1 year incarcerated under these conditions. The military, however, eventually reversed its policy against the Nisei, Japanese Americans, and began recruiting soldiers for the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. Out of 120,000 people imprisoned, about 1,200 mainland Nisei volunteered for combat. Frank Wada was among the first post-and-in-teens to sign up. Wada explained his decision as a pragmatic necessity. When asked why he volunteered,
He stated, "You would have done the same thing. You look around in the camp and you think, if nobody volunteers, how are we ever going to get out of there?" For Wada and his peers, military service was seen as the only avenue to secure their community's freedom and to dismantle the legalized discrimination they faced. This consequential choice was made only 2 weeks before his marriage to Jean Ito, a fellow Poston Intine. Frank Wada left his bride and family behind the barbed wire to report for training. Wada was committed to proving his loyalty through the hardest fight imaginable, but before facing the enemy, he first had to survive the rigorous training in Mississippi alongside a controversial group of soldiers who earned the nickname Buddha Heads.
In the sweltering heat of Camp Shelby, Mississippi, Frank Wada arrived 2 weeks after his marriage, having left his wife Jean and his family confined behind the perimeter fence of Poston. He was ready to fight the Germans, but his first battle was immediately internal, pitting him against his own countrymen within the ranks of the newly formed 442nd Regimental Combat Team. The 442nd was comprised of 2 fiercely distinct groups of Nisei, those from the U.S. mainland and those from Hawaii. The mainlanders, like Wada, were quickly nicknamed Kutonks, a term supposedly derived from the dull, hollow sound their heads made when hit against barracks floors during fights. The Hawaiian volunteers, who made up 2/3 of the regiment's initial strength, were called Buddha Heads, a term that meant pig's heads or pigs. The differences were profound and immediately visible. The Hawaiians spoke pidgin, gambled heavily, and spent their wages freely. The mainland soldiers, the Kutonks, typically spoke formal English, sent the majority of their army pay back to their families who were suffering in the confinement centers, and rarely discussed their difficult, isolated situations. Making the situation more complex, the entire unit was strictly segregated, as all commissioned officers were white, whom the troops referred to as haole. The regiment was riven by friction until a moment of stark revelation brought the 2 groups together. A group of Hawaiian Nisei soldiers visited the Japanese confinement camps, specifically Jerome and Rower, Arkansas. When the Hawaiian troops witnessed their mainland counterparts living in tar paper barracks behind barbed wire, in small rooms lacking privacy, and guarded by machine guns pointed inward, the internal divisions evaporated. This exposure to the reality of mass imprisonment galvanized the unit, creating a profound respect for the severe circumstances faced by the mainlanders. The 442nd became united like a tightly clenched fist. They adopted their famous regimental motto from Hawaiian gambling slang, "Go for broke." Go for broke meant shooting the works, risking everything on a single throw of the dice. For these soldiers, this motto symbolized that they were fighting simultaneously against the German forces in Europe and against the brutal racial prejudice that had imprisoned their families back home. They were not fighting just for military victory, but for the fundamental recognition of their loyalty and the vindication of their entire community. Veteran Tim Torcuno summed up their mentality. They had the idea of proving that we were loyal Americans. We never took a backward step, always forward. After 1 year of intensive training, Frank Wada was shipped overseas to the European battlefields. But their debut combat mission would quickly earn them a terrifying nickname and test the 442nd's go for broke commitment almost immediately in the mountains of Italy.
After a year of rigorous preparation, the soldiers of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, united under the banner of Go for Broke, departed for Europe in April 1944, ready to risk everything for a country that had abandoned their families. But what they soon discovered was that the price of proving their loyalty would be paid in blood at a staggering rate. The regiment landed at Anzio, Naples, and was immediately thrust into the grinding battle to liberate Italy. Their operational debut occurred on June 26, 1944, near Suvereto. The engagement instantly revealed the unit's commitment to fierce forward combat, leading the veteran 100th Battalion, which the 442nd reinforced, to be christened the Purple Heart Battalion for the devastating losses they sustained. Frank Wada, now fighting as a scout in Company E, experienced combat with shocking intensity. The fighting in the Rome-Arno campaign involved liberating towns, seizing heavily protected hills, and crossing the Arno River, forcing the regiment into continuous, brutal engagements across dense terrain. The casualty rate was horrific, demanding instant leadership advancement. Wada's abilities emerged rapidly under heavy fire, leading to his swift promotion. In just 1 month, the Redlands native was elevated first to acting squad leader and soon thereafter to acting platoon sergeant. This rapid rise was testament not just to his skill, but to the constant and severe attrition of officers and non-commissioned officers around him. Frank Wada and his comrades adhered absolutely to their go-for-broke ethos, operating on the conviction that they must never took a backward step, always forward, to demonstrate they were loyal Americans. They were fighting a two-front war, one against the determined German defenders in Italy, and the other against the prejudice they had incarcerated their families back home. After months of unrelenting warfare in the Italian mountains, where they earned a fearsome reputation for bravery and suffered grievous losses, the 442nd was unexpectedly pulled out of the line. In mid-September 1944, they were shipped to France, where the unit would immediately face its most famous and costly test, a high-stakes, desperate search and rescue mission in the rugged, freezing, and strategically vital Vosges Mountains.
In mid-September 1944, after months of brutal fighting that earned them the grim moniker Purple Heart Battalion, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team was pulled from the lines in Italy and shipped to France. The men anticipated rest, recuperation, and warm quarters. Instead, they were plunged into the Vosges Mountains, where the true price of the go-for-broke motto would be paid in the freezing mud. On September 30th, 1944, the unit landed at Marseille and traveled 500 miles through the Rhone Valley to reach the front lines. They were attached to the 36th Infantry Division, commanded by Major General John E. Dahlquist. The campaign began in earnest on October 14, 1944. The Vosges Mountains presented one of the most savage and unforgiving environments of the entire war. The terrain was characterized by densely forested mountains, steep ravines, and narrow logging trails. Constant cold rain turned the paths into debilitating mud. German forces held tenacious defensive positions, and visibility was often restricted to just 12 yards. Soldier Rudy Tokiwa recalled the darkness was so profound that if you held your fingers out, you couldn't see your hand. The regiment was immediately ordered into combat against entrenched German forces. The Battle of Bruyères began on October 15, 1944. The 442nd's initial mission was to capture 4 critical hills, A, B, C, and D, that protected the town. After 3 days of intense fighting through dense forest against entrenched positions, the unit liberated Bruyères on October 18, 1944, following 6 hours of house-to-house combat. The combat was unrelenting. The very next day, the Nisei soldiers assaulted Hills C and D, suffering over 100 casualties in a single day. Hill D earned a terrifying internal nickname, Omaha's Hill, in honor of Tech Sergeant Abraham Ohama of F Company. Frank Wada, serving as a scout in Company E, was immediately embroiled in this fierce forward action. After securing Bruyères, the 100th Battalion was immediately ordered east to Bifontaine, where they faced heavy artillery and fierce house-to-house fighting, seeking to destroy isolated enemy pockets before regrouping. After 10 days of almost continuous combat, the exhausted 442nd was granted a brief respite on October 23rd. But the respite would be shockingly brief, for 2 days later, the 442nd received the urgent, nearly suicidal order that would define their legacy: rescue the 275-man Lost Battalion of the 141st Infantry Regiment.
On October 23, 1944, after 10 days of continuous bloody engagement in the Vosges, the exhausted 442nd was granted a brief reprieve. But only 2 days later, on October 25th, the men were abruptly recalled, receiving an urgent, desperate mission that would define their unit's terrifying legacy and force them to pay the ultimate cost for recognition. 275 men of the 1st Battalion of the 141st Infantry Regiment, quickly dubbed the Lost Battalion, were trapped approximately 4 miles beyond friendly lines near Saint-Dié. They had been isolated by brutal German tactics. The enemy allowed the column to pass their initial positions, then attacked the formation from the rear, effectively cutting the battalion off on 3 sides. The trapped American soldiers were severely compromised, wounded, suffering from a crippling lack of medical care, and critically low on ammunition and food. The command issued to the Nisei troops was utterly ruthless: rescue the Lost Battalion at any cost. The terrain the 442nd was forced to navigate was characterized by steep ravines, muddy logging trails, and 4 miles of heavily mined fields. The conditions were relentless. German artillery used tree bursts, making tactical adjustment nearly impossible, causing lethal shrapnel to rain down from above. Frank Wada's experience confirmed this chilling tactic. Visibility was profoundly low, described as blacker than the inside of a wolf, which hindered the ability of soldiers to see even a short distance ahead. For 6 days of hell, the 442nd fought fiercely, advancing yard by yard through the dense forest against well-camouflaged German machine gun nests. By October 29th, the fighting reached a critical, desperate climax. To finally shatter the German encirclement, the 442nd launched an overwhelming full-out assault that veterans later designated the Banzai Charge, or Suicide Hill. This action demanded total sacrifice. Private Barney Hayiro of I Company exemplified the commitment by charging entrenched German machine gun nests and eliminating 2 snipers. Private Ichigi Kashiwagi of K Company vividly recalled the unit's mentality as they surged forward. "We yelled our heads off and charged and shot the head off everything that moved. We didn't care anymore. We acted like a bunch of savages." This desperate, fierce engagement broke the enemy's resolve, and after a fierce 30-minute exchange of fire, the Germans fled. The breakthrough had been forged in sheer violence, connecting the rescuers with the rescued. But the question remained: what were the final, devastating mathematics of the 442nd's victory, and how much blood had been exchanged to secure the freedom of those 275 trapped men?
The desperate Banzai Charge on October 29, 1944, shattered the German encirclement in the Vosges, allowing the 442nd to reach the 275 trapped men of the Lost Battalion. But the moment of triumph was immediately followed by a reckoning, forcing both the rescuers and the rescued to face the devastating cost of this single high-stakes mission. On October 30th, Companies B, I, and K of the 442nd located the Lost Battalion. Mutsu Sakamoto was the first Japanese-American soldier to reach the Texans. Ad Guy, one of the rescued soldiers, recalled being so relieved he might have hugged Sakamoto. "I don't know. I was just excited to get out of there." The first message radioed back by the Texans was stark: "Patrol from 442nd here. Tell them that we love them." The total number of original men in the 1st Battalion of the 401st Infantry Regiment was 275. Of those, only 211 survived to be rescued. The 442nd had accomplished the impossible, rescuing nearly 4 times the number of men they lost in the process. However, the sheer cost to the 442nd Regimental Combat Team was catastrophic. The entire Vosges campaign, which spanned October and November 1944, resulted in the regiment suffering approximately 800 casualties to rescue the 211 men. The 442nd went into the Vosges with just under 3,000 men. In total, the Vosges campaign resulted in 160 killed, over 1,200 wounded, and 43 missing from the regiment. The scale of attrition was felt acutely in every company. Company K, which started with 186 men, saw only 18 walk out unhurt, a 91% casualty rate. Company I began with 185 men and only 8 walked out unhurt, a 96% casualty rate. Both companies were led by sergeants, as higher-ranking officers and NCOs had been killed or wounded. The sheer volume of loss led Major General Dahlquist, commanding the 36th Infantry Division, to reportedly choke up while trying to speak to the survivors. Senator Daniel Inouye, who was serving in the 442nd, remembered the scene. The saddest retreat parade in the history of the 442nd was over. The terrible casualty statistics later led many Nisei veterans to believe that Dahlquist viewed them as expendable cannon fodder. Frank Wada had survived this crucible, but the fight was not yet finished. He would endure yet another confrontation in the French forest before a German strike brought his frontline combat career to an abrupt, violent halt.
The successful yet devastating rescue of the Lost Battalion had solidified the 442nd's reputation as the fiercest unit on the Western Front. But the victory came at a terrible price. The regiment was nearly destroyed. Frank Wada, having survived the desperate fighting, was granted a minimal respite before the unit was thrown back into the frigid, forested terrain of France for yet another confrontation. Frank Wada, still serving as a scout in Company E, was tasked with securing a hill foxhole position, which was surrounded by heavy timber and perpetually muddy. This location overlooked a small French village the German forces continued to stubbornly hold. The Germans employed a devastating and specific artillery tactic designed to maximize carnage in the dense forest. Instead of firing shells directly onto the ground, the German artillery crews aimed for tree bursts. When these rounds exploded in the treetops, the impact caused shrapnel and deadly wood splinters to rain down upon the American soldiers concealed below. Frank Wada's frontline career ended violently on the very first day of the battle for this hillside. He was struck by shrapnel in 3 places in his lower body. He later vividly recounted the scene, saying that he could see the German tank in the town, and it shot in the trees above me, and the shrapnel came down like rain. Wada was evacuated, having been in combat for less than 4 months. He spent 3 months from October 1944 through January 1945 recovering in a military hospital in Naples, Italy. The statistics of the unit's commitment were crushing. Wada recovered to find himself the only man in his entire squadron alive and uninjured, a staggering 99% casualty rate. The attrition extended across the regiment. His friend Ted, who served in K Company of the 3rd Battalion, was one of only 17 men to walk out unhurt after the campaign, enduring a 91% casualty rate. Frank Wada could have accepted a medical discharge or a safer rear echelon assignment following his recovery. Instead, despite the shrapnel wounds, the emotional toll, and the knowledge that his family remained imprisoned back home, the Redlands native made the remarkable decision to return to combat in January 1945 and resume command of his squad in Company E. His loyalty still demanded the ultimate proof.
Frank Wada had defied the odds, recovering from shrapnel wounds that had ripped into his lower body to become the sole uninjured survivor of his Company E squad. Refusing a discharge, he returned to Company E in January 1945 to face the ultimate test of the European War, the final, massive offensive against the German defensive line in northern Italy. The 442nd had been secretly deployed back to Italy in March 1945, having been pulled from their rest period along the French-Italian border, a quiet zone known as the Champagne Campaign. Their mission was to break the formidable German fortifications of the Gothic Line in the Apennine Mountains. The regiment was attached to the 92nd Infantry Division, an all-African-American unit for this clandestine push. The final assault launched on April 5, 1945. The operation centered on Mount Folgorito, where the Germans believed their position was impregnable. The Nisei soldiers were ordered to execute what was initially intended as a decoy attack. To achieve complete surprise, the 442nd scaled the steep slopes of the mountain in darkness, ascending a grueling 3,000-foot mountainside. The German defenses, stunned by the unexpected attack from what they considered an impossible direction, immediately crumbled at dawn. The successful breakthrough effectively shattered the Gothic Line. Frank Wada was part of this crucial final assault, which propelled the Allied victory in Italy. The war in Italy officially ended less than a month later on May 2, 1945. The combat career of Frank Minoru Wada was over. Having lasted less than 4 months of active fighting, he was honorably discharged in December 1945, nearly 2 years after he had been separated from his wife, Jean, who remained behind barbed wire. Although they had fought in the harshest possible conditions and suffered devastating losses, including 800 killed or missing, the total wartime contingent of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team had earned recognition as the most decorated unit for its size and length of service in the entire history of the United States military. Wada and his comrades had proved their loyalty in blood, securing for the regiment over 18,000 individual decorations. But upon returning home to California, they quickly discovered that the battle for acceptance was far from over. Frank Wada, an American hero, was coming home to a nation that had barely changed.
Frank Wada had secured the most challenging objective of his life, the successful Allied offensive that broke the Gothic Line in Italy, ending the war in Europe on May 2, 1945. He received his honorable discharge in December 1945. His return home, however, marked the start of his final and perhaps most difficult battle, confronting a nation that had barely changed. Frank Wada returned to his wife Jean, who had spent nearly 2 years behind barbed wire while he fought in European combat. Despite the 442nd's extraordinary record, earning recognition as the most decorated unit for its size and length of service in U.S. military history, Frank and his comrades returned to continued discrimination. The veteran soldiers were often met with signs saying "No Japs allowed" and "No Japs wanted" in businesses across the West Coast. Some were refused service in shops and restaurants. President Harry S. Truman later recognized the 442nd on July 15, 1946, telling the regiment, "You fought not only the enemy, but you fought prejudice, and you have won. Keep up that fight, and we will continue to win." Yet the immediate reality was bleak. Frank Wada was offered a job at a factory in Redlands, but his former employers, feeling the pressure of anti-Japanese sentiment, later had to inform him that they could no longer employ him. Wada chose a path of quiet resilience. He and Jean focused on raising their family and pursuing a stable federal service career. Wada went on to work for the U.S. Postal Service and then for Navy Public Works as a mechanical planner, estimator, and contract specialist, federal service that offered stability and a middle-class income. Frank Minoru Wada, the man who had traded confinement for combat to prove his loyalty, remained remarkably humble. When asked late in life what his service and sacrifices meant to him, Frank Wada answered simply, "Nothing." This modest response was typical of Japanese Americans, who often minimize their achievements, avoiding attention. For most of his 99 years, Frank Wada didn't talk about his service. His daughter noted that her father didn't like to discuss his wartime experiences or the internment. This silence was cultural, shaped by values of gaman, enduring, and shikata ganai, it cannot be helped. However, late in life, Frank Wada revealed a different story through objects. He filled photos, artifacts, and memorabilia from his service. Among the items were a small, detailed wooden model of the internment barracks he had built at Poston, his regimental banner, his congressional gold medal, and a Go for Broke license plate. These objects served as silent witnesses to the sacrifice and courage of his comrades. Frank Minoru Wada passed away peacefully on June 14, 2021.
His marriage to Jean, a union that began 2 weeks before he left the Poston Confinement Center for combat, lasted 69 years until Jean's death in 2012. His life spanned the journey from childhood discrimination on colored days to imprisonment by his own government, through combat where he was wounded, and finally through the redress movement that secured an apology and reparations. Frank Wada and his 18,000 Nisei comrades proved their loyalty in blood. They fought for an America that could acknowledge its gravest mistakes, learn from them, and commit to never repeating them. Their sacrifice secured the title of the most decorated unit in U.S. history and helped reshape American civil rights. Frank Minoru Wada was believed to be the last local San Diego area survivor of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team at the time of his death.